Hello and welcome to Mel Make Stuff. My name is Melissa and this is episode 19. I want to thank everyone for the nice feedback on my last video about my 2023 project plans. I'm going to be talking about two of those projects today. For one of these projects, there were a couple of folks who had some concerns about my yarn choice that I had said I was planning to use, and so I thought that we could have a little discussion today about yarn choice for cables specifically, but just a little bit of yarn choice 101, and as you can see, I have a lot of visual aids to go over. So let's start by talking about that project. This is the Enamorado Pullover sweater by Valentina Bogdanova. And this is a bottom-up raglan, and I have not made a raglan in this style for a long time. I have done seamed raglans that are knit from the bottom up, but this one actually has you knit the body in the round to the armholes. It has you knit the sleeves in the round to where they join up, and then you join both sleeves and the body in the round and start doing your raglan decreases towards the top. So let me show you where I am so far. I have gotten a long way. This is a pretty large gauge. It's a worsted weight held with a mohair is what I'm choosing to use. The original pattern calls for one of those blown yarns that's like a cotton tube with the floofy yarn in the inside. It's, you know, approximately a worsted or bulky weight. And so you can see I have done the majority of my raglan decreases here. So I actually started with the sleeves, and this was sort of the dilemma for me because if you've been here for a little while, you know that my arms are quite short and I'm always having to shorten the sleeve length. And in this instance, I wasn't entirely sure how much to shorten it. And it's also an instance where I can't easily adjust it after the fact. I tried to consider a lot of options for getting around that so that I could change the sleeve length at the end, and none of them were perfect. So what I would usually do is start by casting on provisionally, like at the bottom of the rib or at the top of the rib if you're coming from the bottom up, and just knit this part of the sleeve and come back and knit the cuff down. The reason I did not want to do that is because when you knit in two different directions like that, you knit the sleeve in one direction, knit your cuff the other way, your direction of your stitches changes. And one of the beautiful things about this pattern, which has so many really nice, just subtle details, is that the rib on the cuff goes directly into some of these ribs that are on the sleeve. And when you knit in the other direction, your stitches will often be like half a stitch off. So those weren't going to line up perfectly. And that was one of the just very subtle things that I really liked about this pattern. So I decided to knit the sleeves as written, and I just ended up, so I knit the sleeves to a couple inches less than I thought I would need. And then I knit the body. And once I got to the point where I was thinking about joining them all, I did knit a couple extra rounds on the sleeves just to hopefully get them in exactly the right spot. We'll see. The one thing I wanted to avoid with this sweater was having too short sleeves. I wanted them to be slightly on the longer side, which is not my usual. I tend to like sort of a bracelet length, but for something like this, that's going to be a heavier sweater, I definitely wanted like a full length sort of blousey sleeve. The pattern does call for a tubular cast on, which I did. And let me show you the beautiful details on the body. So the body as well starts with a tubular cast on. This is another area where I was thinking, you know, I might like to provisionally cast on here in case I need to adjust the length of the body, because as you can see, it is cropped. The sweater comes with a cropped and a full length option. And so I did the cropped option from the pattern. I didn't like make this up. But here we have another situation where the ribs on the body grow out of these ribs in the ribbing. So I wanted to actually do this as written so I could get that effect. And we just have an absolutely gorgeous stitch pattern here. So we have some twisted stitch cables. All of these ribs on the body are also made with twisted knit stitches. We have twisted rib at the bottom, half twisted rib. And so if I get up a little closer, you can hopefully see that these little cables here are twisted stitches. We really just have mostly like one by one, gradually sort of moving cables there. And then we have a nice big fat 4/4 cable in the middle. And then we also have these wrapped stitches, which are very easy to create. You just move a number of stitches to a cable needle, hold it in front, and actually physically wrap the yarn around it, and then you just continue knitting. It's explained very clearly in the pattern. So just to give myself a little bit of security, because I don't usually knit sweaters with this construction, and from the schematic, it's a little bit hard to tell how deep the yoke is. It's meant to be a little bit of a deeper yoke, I think, and I also sized up from the size recommended for my bust. So I think I'm going to be getting around 7 inches of positive ease, and it was supposed to be more like 4, something like that. So I was a little bit like, I wasn't quite sure how this was going to work out as far as the yoke depth. And so I did insert some lifelines, so I could, in theory, rip out the entire yoke back to where I joined the sleeves to the body and rework that. But I really don't want to do that. It's really hard to see it. It's a little pink. I inserted a pink lifeline here. So I've gotten quite some ways. You can see that yoke really is quite deep. And here you can see my raglan decreases towards the top, basically just at a 45-degree angle there. So I am actually very close to the end of the raglan decreases as written in the pattern. And I have a ton of stitches still left on the needles. I mean, that's like my shoulder circumference right there. And so what happens after this is that there are more rapid decreases to bring this in just the same rib pattern that's on the sleeves or something similar to a closer rib for the neck, for the stand-up turtleneck. So hopefully that will work out. So the yarns that I'm using for this are some Fox Hill Farm Romney worsted. And I don't like using the word rustic because I feel like it basically means nothing at this point. But this yarn, how would I describe this? It's a farm yarn, a small farm in Western Massachusetts. They raise Romneys and Cormos and probably other breeds as well. It's soft, but not like Merino soft. It's not scratchy at all. It's woolen spun, very lofty, very light, and beautiful. It's got just a beautiful natural color of this Romney. So not all Romney is this nice and soft. I think we'll be talking more about Romney in the future because I recently went to a local yarn festival and bought some more that is very different than this, but also beautiful. So we'll talk about that another time. So I'm holding this worsted weight together with some Shibui mohair in the colorway Mineral. I know this Shibui is not making this anymore. If you're looking for something comparable to this in terms of the quality, the Pearl Soho Tussock, which I have used, is quite close to this, I find. Although they don't have the nice, like, subtle colors necessarily. Like, Shibui had a lot of really nice, like this one. This is just a weird color. You know, it's not gray, it's not purple, it's somewhere in between. And I find that it blends very nicely with a lot of different colors and gives interesting sort of watercolor effects. So these are what I'm using together. And that brings us to our discussion today. So I want to emphasize that there is zero shade to this commenter at all. There were a couple people who commented that, you know, they were worried about my yarn choice. And I think, you know, this one comment in particular sort of got me thinking that this would be a good illustration for yarn choice around cables and to some extent lace, because we often find them paired together. And so I wanted to thank this commenter because I thought that the comment was very interesting. So what the person said was, great project plans for the new year. Just a thought, I personally wouldn't use mohair with the first cable sweater pattern you showed, which was the Enamorado. A cable pattern is all about clear stitch definition, and the mohair will take away that definition with its fuzziness. Will be interesting to see how that comes out. So thank you for that comment, because I think that that definitely illustrates already a level of like yarn choice knowledge that, you know, it's hard to find information about how to choose yarns out there. There's like a lot of information out there and none of it is particularly well organized, and like this isn't going to be either because yarn choice is so big of a topic and also has a lot to do with both conventional wisdom and also personal taste, and those don't always line up. So hopefully I can speak in some sort of cohesive way about this. So just to try to put a lens on this, I would like to talk about yarn choice in the context of cables. And so first, let's do a little bit of yarn construction 101. I'm going to be talking about plies. And when I'm talking about like a 2-ply, 3-ply, 4-ply, I'm talking about the actual number of single strands that are plied together to make a yarn. So let me show you an example of this. So the conventional wisdom about cables, which is what this commenter was referring to, is that you want to use a yarn that is very round, and that usually translates to a 3-ply or a 4-ply yarn. Here's what I mean by 3-ply. So this is actually the yarn that I just finished using for my sweater from the Japanese pattern book, and which has cables. I'll show you here in a second. And so you can see there are 3 separate strands that are all plied together to make up this one strand of yarn that you knit with. I've got a lot of blisters on my hands from weightlifting, so I'm sorry if that is grossing anyone out. So here is what the single strand looks like, and I will show you another example here in a second that's a little bit easier to tell, but the surface of the yarn is quite smooth, and that's the thing that's going to give good definition in a cable situation. 3-ply and 4-ply yarns are both very good for cables. Once you start getting into more than 4 plies, I don't personally like using those yarns because then the yarn gets to be very heavy and your sweater ends up weighing a lot because of all those additional plies. So I'll show you an example of that here in a moment. Before we go on, I just want to show you a traditional 2-ply yarn. So here we go. This is a 2-ply. It's a light fingering weight, but you can see two separate plies. And this yarn, the surface of the yarn on a 2-ply is just less smooth. There are many other factors that go into this, including whether it's worsted or woolen spun or what type of the material is and blah, blah, blah. This is just like very, very basic yarn construction 101, right? So conventional wisdom says 3-ply yarns are good for cables and 2-ply yarns are good for lace. And the in a nutshell reason for this is that 3-ply yarns, 4-ply yarns, when they're knitted together, the yarns tend to sort of want to be near each other. The way the stitches lay is very compact. And with a 2-ply yarn, it's the opposite. So the holes tend to be more emphasized. The yarns sort of want to fall away from each other. And so if you are knitting lace with a 2-ply yarn and you want to really emphasize those holes in a lace shawl or whatever, the yarn just naturally wanting to sort of open up a little bit is going to emphasize those holes. Does this mean that you cannot use a 2-ply yarn for cables or a 3-ply yarn for lace? Absolutely not. I break that rule all the time. I don't even consider it really a rule. It's just one of those situations, and I can't remember if I've said this yet already, but knowing the rules before you break them can be helpful. I didn't do this. I just farted around for years, just knitting with whatever. And it was really only recently that I started learning more about the construction and that type of thing. So to a large degree, just do what you want, experiment, see what effects you like, right? Because you might not always be going for a super high definition on a cable. You might want something a little more ethereal or a little less defined for whatever reason, right? So the best examples that I found to illustrate this concept are usually in spinning books. This one is from Jillian Marino's Yarnitecture book, which is a beautiful book for spinners, or really if you want to learn just more about yarn construction in general. This is a nice book. So here, and of course this is all in the context of hand spinning, so this yarn is going to be more irregular than a machined yarn anyway, but the concepts are the same. So here we have some swatches knit with a 2-ply yarn. And you can hopefully see the lace swatch has nice open holes because, again, that 2-ply yarn is wanting to open up a little bit and emphasize those holes here. And now here we have a cable. You can definitely tell there's a cable there. It just maybe isn't the most defined cable ever, right? Which is fine. This might be the effect that you want. So if we contrast this with the next page, which has the same swatches knitted in a 3-ply, you can see in the lace, the holes are just a little bit de-emphasized. It's not, they're not as open as in the 2-ply yarn. And then over here, we have this cable, which is now popping a little bit more with this rounder 3-ply yarn. So let's look at a bunch of examples in some hand knitted garments that I have. So a lot of folks, when they're thinking about traditional cabled garments, will think about an Aran sweater. And so I have some Aran wool here that I bought when I was in Ireland. This is just very traditional. It's the natural white color, and this is a 3-ply Aran weight yarn. So this is what all of those very traditional Aran sweaters are knit with. It's a very round yarn, and it makes those cables and textures really pop. And here is a hand-knitted Aran sweater. So I actually did not knit this. This is like a family heirloom garment that was purchased, I would guess, maybe in the 80s. And it is hand-knitted, but by an artisan. And so you can see, I'll maybe put some footage in here of me wearing this too, but this is a fantastic sweater. Look at these sleeves, first of all. My God, they are amazing. So we have some textured patterns here, some baubles, and you can just see how these motifs are like leaping off of the background of this garment, right? And part of the reason for that is that yarn, that 3-ply, very defined, smooth yarn. The other reason that cables might leap like this, or cables might be very defined, is because it's knitted at quite a tight gauge for that yarn. So again, gauge is another factor with your yarn choice. Don't be overwhelmed. You don't have to really fully absorb all this stuff at once. I find that a lot of learning takes place when you have just a little bit of knowledge, and then you can explore and see what you think versus what other people are telling you to think. So yeah, I'm just going to tell you what I think here. If you disagree, that's totally fine. It doesn't affect me, and I do not care in the slightest what other people are doing. So if you don't agree with me, or if you do something different or whatever, I think that's great. Here is another example. This is the Cardi. I will put the names of all these patterns down below, so if you want to Google them, you're welcome to. And this was knit with I believe it was a 4-ply worsted weight. So again, you can see I'm just getting really defined cables. I have worn this garment a lot, so you see a little bit of fuzzing up, but nothing that will obscure these bold cables that are partially standing out because they're large on the front of the garment, and partially standing out because of that very round yarn that I used for this. And then here's another good example. So this is the yarn that I pulled the plies apart earlier to show you, and this is the sweater that I just finished with the Fin sheep yarn from Mega that I received. Thank you so much, Mega. And you can hopefully see that this yarn, even with this hand-dyed variation, unlike the other two which were undyed and commercially dyed, because this yarn is a nice smooth 3-ply, even with this variation in the dye job, I am still getting a lot of definition in this cable and broken rib pattern there. Okay, so those are my garments that are sort of following conventional wisdom about the yarn choice that you should use when you are knitting cables. Let's look at some other examples that are sort of going off the beaten path a little bit. So here's another one that you have recently seen. This is my Colleen vest, which I just finished. And you can see, I mean, this is heavily cabled, but I used a 2-ply yarn for this, right? I used a very typical Shetland yarn for this. And I would have gotten a much more defined look on these cables. They would be really jumping off the garment if I had used a 3-ply fingering weight or more, 4-ply fingering weight. So with this, I'm getting just a little bit less definition than I might otherwise. But one of the things that I personally like about having just a little bit less definition is that it creates a very romantic, sort of ethereal look. And, some people might rightfully say, I'm not spending all of that time knitting a garment like that if those cables aren't really going to like smack you in the face with how defined they are. And that's totally fine. That's, I understand that, I wouldn't knit a heavily cabled garment like this in a variegated yarn, for example, because to me, knitting complicated cables, spending the time to do that, and using a variegated yarn that's really going to obscure those cables when you're looking at it, that for me isn't something that I'm going to do, but I totally respect other people's desire to do it if they want. Here's another example of this. This is a Sari Nordlund pattern. The name will be down below. It's a cardigan that has this lace up at the top. You will have seen this on an earlier episode last year, the year before maybe. And this is another example where, so we have some lace and some cable motifs here. And this is also knitted with a 2-ply. And so again, we're getting a little bit less definition, but it's enough because the color of the yarn is, this is an undyed Cormo. So because the yarn itself is not overly busy, even though it's a 2-ply, we're still getting nice definition in these motifs. This garment is, some of you will remember, a Joji Locatelli Recoleta cardigan that I made last year, the year before. All the years are blurring. I don't know. It's been on the channel. And you can see, again, we have another sort of lace and cable pattern. And for this one, this yarn, I believe, is a 4-ply. So it's a very round yarn. And I did make that decision knowing that the cables were going to pop out more than the little lacy holes were going to be emphasized. And so that is just a choice. You know, because this is really largely a lace pattern, I would sort of consider this more lace than cables. If I had chosen a 2-ply yarn, those holes in the lace might be a little bit more open and emphasized, but it's so minor that it's, you know, I had this yarn in my stash. I used it. I'm very happy with it. I would choose it again for this pattern. I think I used Cascade 220 for this. Fairly sure that's a 4-ply. And so just to show you what a lace knitted in a 2-ply yarn actually does look like, this is the Ivy line cardigan, which I knit a long time ago and have worn a lot. I dyed the yarn for this myself back in the day, and it is just a 2-ply merino, superwash merino yarn. So you can see the front of this is all lace, and we do have these holes in these lace patterns are just very open on the front. So this is sort of, you know, 2-ply yarn working as intended here, really emphasizing these nice lace details. So I mentioned earlier that I typically don't use a yarn that has more than 4 plies, and this garment is the reason for that. This is the Stag Pullover, which many people will know by Norah Gaughan. I knitted this some years ago. It's knitted flat, heavily cabled. For this pattern, I used an 8-ply yarn, which I had gotten like the first time I ever went to Webb's, and it was on sale and blah, blah, blah. It was the smoothest, the surface of that yarn, because there are so many plies, was so smooth. I mean, it was like a flat surface. And so you can see that there is incredible definition in these cables. This was when I was just starting to get into like trying to choose the right yarn for cables. And I was like, well, the more plies, the better, right? And so it does look nice, right? It looks very defined. We have the same effect as in the very first traditional Aran garment I showed you, where the cables are like leaping off of the garment. But because this yarn has so many plies, it is so heavy. Like, I put this thing on and I feel like I'm wearing a weighted vest, and it's just not enjoyable to wear. I'm not super fussy about my garments being very light, but this one is too heavy for me, for my personal taste. So this was sort of where I learned that lesson myself. And so to bring it back around to the Enamorado, let us talk just a little bit about the addition of mohair, because mohair does obscure something like a defined cable pattern. And sometimes, as is the case with the Enamorado and my personal preference, that might be what you want. So I have a couple examples. I'm wearing an example, so we can talk about this one first. This is the Favo by Fiber Tales. And for this sweater, I used a very round yarn for the base yarn, which is sort of a lighter pink. And I added a slightly darker mohair, which, if I had used a mohair that really matched this light pink base color that I used, it would obscure this pattern a little bit more. But what using a darker mohair has done is actually really emphasize the cables in an interesting way. It sort of fills in, you know, the darker mohair fibers fill in the holes in the pattern and sort of emphasize them, which I love. I don't have either of these yarns at hand right now, but hopefully you can see that there is that darker variation in the mohair. So this is sort of an example of how you can add mohair while still either maintaining or even emphasizing cable definition in a pattern. And then in this example, I pretty much did everything you're not supposed to do in a cable garment. And I love this sweater. I wear this one all the time. This is my Sawyer by Sari Nordlund. This sweater pattern originally calls for a Corriedale that has those tweed flecks in it that are made with a bunch of different like leftover yarn colors. I think it might be the hedgehog version was what this pattern was originally knit in. And so what I decided to do, because I wanted to use yarns for my stash, was to use a superwash 2-ply BFL tweed that I had. So it was a sort of light on the gray side of natural color, and it had dark black and brown flecks as the tweed. And I held that together with a sort of dark reddish brown mohair. So for this sweater, I did all the things that you are not supposed to do, right? I used a 2-ply yarn, I used mohair in a cable pattern, and yet I think that this is amazing. I mean, I love the effect that both that tweed yarn and combining it with this dark mohair has given, right? It again is sort of emphasizing these cable and twisted stitch patterns here in a way that I think is, again, it just has a little bit of an ethereal, sort of otherworldly quality. Like, this is the sweater that when I am wearing this, people come up to me and say like, that looks like it's made out of silver, like very dramatic, you know, it gets very dramatic responses. And yet this is the one where I sort of broke all the rules. So with this whole thing of combining a darker mohair with a lighter color base yarn, there is a line where sometimes there will be too much of a difference between those two colors and it will start to look marled and then it will obscure the pattern. And that is really dependent on what it is you're making. So there's not a hard and fast rule around that, in my opinion. I don't think there are hard and fast rules around much of knitting, unlike, it seems many people have a lot of rules that they think must be followed. I'm not talking about this particular commenter, but just people in the knitting world. I have witnessed a lot of comments on other videos and to some extent comments on my videos of people telling me I'm doing things wrong, which honestly I find to be sort of entertaining at this point. But I can understand how it would be very hard if you are a newer knitter, and you're sort of less confident about some of these things and you have somebody telling you like you can't do XYZ. I think that's crap. It is hard to figure it out, but it's also not something that needs to be figured out immediately. You know, you learn through the process because so much of it is about what you yourself prefer, not necessarily what conventional wisdom says or what the rules say or what, you know, X person on Instagram says is the way you're supposed to do something. So getting back to the Enamorado, this is a little bit different from these other mohair sweaters I've shown you because this mohair that I'm using is actually quite close in color to this base yarn here. And so there was definitely a chance that this could wash out a pattern or make it less defined, make a cable pattern less defined in an unpleasant way. And so that's why I think that this was a very good comment, because a lot of times that will be true in this situation. The reason that it's not in this particular situation, at least in my opinion, is that this cable pattern is so bold that there's like not much that's going to obscure this. You know, we have two elements in my opinion that are making it so bold. One is the use of twisted stitches throughout will really define, like even just a knit column like this, in a way that if these stitches were just knitted normally, they would be slightly less defined. And the other thing is these wrapped stitches, which are just very, I mean, there's no hiding that. And so even though my yarn choice is probably giving less definition in this finished garment than a very smooth yarn would, I think that this effect is beautiful. It's one of those sweaters that just looks almost like a piece of metal, you know, like it's so dreamy, for lack of a better word. At this point, I'm mainly just concerned with this fitting me. I really hope it fits because I really love this thing. I've had a fun time working on it. Yeah, the pattern is both charted and written out. The cable pattern is written out, which is epic. But if you're somebody who likes reading off of written directions, that is available in this pattern. And so that is my Enamorado and my commentary on yarn choice for cables. So thank you so much for your comments about that, because they really made me think that this would be a good thing to discuss on the podcast. And let me know your thoughts. The other project that I have to discuss with you today is the Scout Shawl by Florence Spurling. I have been eyeing this shawl for a little while, and it is my first real foray into intarsia. And so far, it's actually going very well, I think. So there are a couple things that attracted me to this pattern. I wanted to learn intarsia, and I figured that this would be a nice sort of intro to that. I like the fact that it looks like a patchwork quilt. And I also really like the color palette. And so I had decided that I wanted to try to recreate her colors as closely as I could, but using yarns that I had on hand in my stash already. I didn't want to buy yarn for this. These are the yarns that I ended up using. And here is how far I have gotten. I'm about a third of the way through. And so you can just get a sense of the color palette here. It's quite close to the original. I think she might have been using something slightly more pink and mine is slightly more orangey, this contrast color here. But I really like playing with combining like pinks and greens and reds and greens. I am into that right now. So this is how this is going. So one of the things, I have made my life slightly more difficult by choosing these yarns from my stash, because they are actually all different bases. So the pattern calls for fingering weight yarn, and I'm mostly following that, but the quality of the yarn bases is all different. And so let me try to show you. So this one here is actually a sport weight, which doesn't help matters, but this is Dirty Water Dyeworks Sport, Cashmere Sport, I think. This is a leftover from another project. This is just a 2-ply merino superwash. All of these are superwash yarns, I believe. This is a 2-ply merino that I dyed back in the day. This is a 2-ply tweed base, which I also dyed myself back in the day. This is the same base, incidentally, that I used in my Sawyer sweater. This is a Farmer's Daughter Fibers, which I think is a 4-ply. So it's a very smooth yarn. And then this one here is a singles. This is Valentina Colorworks, I think. I'll put it down below. And so having all of these yarns be so different in like surface texture from each other is making it something that I have to pay attention to as I'm working through this project. I'm not, and I knew this going into it because I had chosen these yarns, I wasn't expecting to get a super uniform fabric because of the different textures and in one case, the thickness of this yarn. It's not going to look super uniform, but I'm sort of okay with that. I actually sort of like that because it emphasizes the like homey, patchwork quilt-y nature of this object. So I'm not dissatisfied with that, and I think it's actually sort of adding a little something interesting. I'm gonna have a hell of a time getting myself set up to start the next row of this because I've misarranged all of my balls. Yeah, the one thing about this project, so I would say if you have done color work before and you are experienced enough with color work, and particularly if you've done color work flat, this is a great first intarsia project. I'm not having any problem with the intarsia at all. If you are not familiar with color work and also not familiar with intarsia, I wouldn't start here, just because yarn management is such a beast for this project. So structure-wise, the pattern has you take your first color that you start with and wind off a couple of balls to be used for the borders. So you start the shawl at this skinny end, and you end up doing the intarsia right away. Let's see, not so easy to show when it's all curled up like this. Okay. So initially, when you start with your little tab of that first color, and you have 2 balls of this wound off. So I am using bobbins, which look like this, for just the colors on the sides. That's what I've chosen to do. I could be using bobbins for all of the colors, but I actually, I find the bobbins to be a little bit annoying. So you basically just wind yarn from your ball onto this little plastic bobbin. And then when you close it up, it just is held in there and you can pull off what you need. So these are very convenient. I got these at Webb's. And so I had, at the beginning, my one bobbin on this side. I had my first color, which is this cream. And then I had my other bobbin on the other side. And that's basically the deal. You twist your yarns at the back of the work, which is explained in the pattern. And it is just as simple as it is explained. So one of the things that had caused me to avoid intarsia for so long was that I couldn't quite wrap my head around like how I was supposed to be wrapping the yarns in the back to avoid getting a hole between intarsia sections. And it's actually, it's very easy. You always wrap it in a consistent way. And so this is what it ends up looking. I'll show you the front and then the back of another couple sections here. So once you get up into these other sections where you have a lot of colors joined, this is where the yarn management challenge begins. So you have one bobbin here. You have two colors that are working in color work in this section, two other colors working in color work in this section. Even though this contrast color here is the same as the colors on the edges, you use your main ball for this contrast color section here. And continue with your bobbin on the other side. And so you can see these joins here. This is an intarsia join going along here. And you can see there's really no holes there that I can see. And here again is what it looks like on the back. I haven't woven in my ends yet, so it's a little messy, but you can see here is the intarsia join between these two sections. And then continuing on. So I would say that the hardest part of this pattern for me is not the intarsia. It's definitely managing all of the yarn colors across this whole section. When you have like 4 patterning colors going on in the color work plus the 2 bobbins on the ends. And also I really do not like reading charts from an iPad. And so the pattern is extremely clear. It's fully charted. It's charted in color for people who like that. And it's easy to read the charts. I just don't like staring at a tablet. And so I sort of petered out on this a little bit and I've been working on the sweater more. I don't have a color printer at home, so I really just need to print this pattern and work from it that way. So if you have not knit color work flat before, but you are very confident in knitting color work in the round and like following color work charts and that sort of thing, I don't think this would be a problem. But just know going into it that like your main challenge at that point is probably going to be knitting the color work flat and being able to keep the tension on the wrong side rows consistent and also managing your yarn. And so what I do when I am knitting a row on this is that I know that I cannot get up before I knit a right side and a wrong side row because I have my yarns all set up in such a way that I knit across and then when I get to that point where I need to do a wrong side row, I turn it clockwise. All of my yarns are doing whatever. They look like they're getting super tangled. I purl back across and then I turn the work counterclockwise and magically all of my yarns are still aligned. If I have to get up in the middle of that process, it's just like a complete cluster, which is what's happening right now. So this is fun. I am looking forward to getting back to this because I'm a third of the way done. You know, I would like to just keep going once I get that printed copy of the pattern. Maybe you can see a little bit what I'm talking about with the different quality of these yarns. I don't mean quality as in like good or bad quality, but just different. So you can see like this background color here is a singles yarn and the contrast color is a tweed. And am I getting less definition? Absolutely. If I was using 2 solid colored yarns, this would look far different than it does, right? But I like that there are going to be certain sections of this piece that are just not defined. in a very explicit way. And I think that that's sort of like an interesting juxtaposition against something like this because of the drastic difference between how dark and light these colors are. This is going to be a very defined section, right? So like not everything needs to pop, in my opinion, in this particular piece anyway. Here again, this is the singles yarn in the contrast color here. The green is the singles. And I just love this looks like a watercolor painting to me. Like you can tell that there's a pattern here. You can sort of tell what it is, but because of the variegation and also the fact that the yarn is a single ply, it's just a little bit less defined. So that is the Scout Shawl. It is going to take me like 20 years to untangle all of those yarns and get them situated so that I can start my next row. So that will be fun. I'll probably put that off a little bit more, and maybe I'll finish the Enamorado before I go back to the Scout. So I think that is all that I have for you today. Please do keep those questions and comments coming because I do find them very interesting and also useful as a way to sort of focus discussion on the podcast a little bit. I can just show you my stuff, but when we can have a more interesting and in-depth discussion like this, I do enjoy putting content like that out. So thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. I really do appreciate them. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.